I'm Sandra Anderson, and I practiced law with Field LLP before my retirement a year ago, and I was counsel for Leilani and the other sterilization victims for a number of years of my practice. "40 years ago, when the Sexual Sterilization Act was repealed, I think it marked a milestone in the way Alberta treated its less fortunate citizens, because before that, especially if they were what was called mental defectives, they were subject to being sterilized without their permission or, in some cases, their knowledge. After that, we saw quite a different approach to treating the mentally handicapped, as they're sometimes known. I only became a lawyer in 1990, so this was long after that repeal. And when it was repealed, I was a fairly new Albertan, and I was not living in Edmonton, and it just really, I don't think, came to my attention. But of course it came very vividly and forcefully to my attention once I joined Field and became involved in this case. I don't really have any way of knowing how many Albertans knew about the repeal. I would hope that many rejoiced in it when it did happen, but it would be difficult for them to have known of the impact of that, because the dark history of what was happening before the repeal I think only came out in the 1990s when the Leilani case came to trial and the aftermath of that. Well, that's a very long and complex story to talk about the dark history, and that was largely what the lawsuit was about. But basically, the Sexual Sterilization Act was enacted in 1928 to respond to a movement of somewhat pseudo-scientific valor, which said that if we improve the breeding stock of people, we will start to wipe out all of the scourges of humanity. That was a widely held belief at the time. So the idea was that if you put people into confined institutions and you sterilize them so that they could not propagate and carry on their deficiencies, society would gradually improve. So this became a government program carried out on a wide range of citizens, many of whom were not what was termed in those days mental defective. And you have to remember that it wasn't just the Sexual Sterilization Act that was working in this program, but the Mental Defectives Act. So there were several pieces of legislation which contributed to a society where the marginalized, often the poor, were institutionalized, and then the Sexual Sterilization Act set up something called the Eugenics Board, which was a group of high-standing citizens, some medical people, who were entrusted with the responsibility of deciding who should be sterilized or not. When I talked about the dark history in Alberta in relation to two pieces of legislation. This was simply Alberta's way of responding to a wider social movement of eugenics, which I described, but the specific outcome, that is sterilization of individuals, was widespread. British Columbia did it, not so many people as I understand it. There were, without legislative authority, these kinds of practices were carried on in the rest of the country, here and there, and certainly in the States. This happened. I remember reading that the state of Virginia sterilized about 16,000 people, and it did occur in Europe and elsewhere. We were never able to find a direct connection with the Nazi regime, or that one influenced the other, but certainly the thinking of the Nazis, that is, that you can improve people by emphasizing good racial characteristics and eliminating bad ones, has a resonance between both the Alberta experience and the Nazi regime. If the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta had not been repealed in 1972, it's difficult to imagine that at some point the newer way of thinking about treating mentally handicapped people would not have had some influence on the way the Eugenics Board was operating and so forth. I can recall from my review of the records we eventually got for some 750 clients or so, that those people who remained institutionalized beyond 1973 had a very different type of records. It's quite dramatic to read the records, for example, of Leilani Muir, who was institutionalized and sterilized in the 1950s, basically, with their pejorative language about the individuals, their forms which didn't allow for positive things to be recorded about the individuals. By contrast, by about 1973 and thereafter, when the community placement movement, you could call it, came or was beginning to take effect, there was a very, very different approach to people, and you see it reflected in the records, where you have much more social interaction with the people. You're encouraging them in a whole variety of ways, and so I think that even without the repeal of the Act, things would have gradually gotten different. But what was good about the repeal of the Act was that Peter Lougheed came in, he swept away some of the old cobwebs, and this was one of the first items on his agenda, to repeal the Sexual Sterilization Act, aided very much by his then assistant, David King. I became involved in Leilani's case fairly early, quite early in my career. I actually articled to now Justice Myra Bealby, who was a senior lawyer in our firm at the time, and through her I came to know that she had drafted the statement of claim against the government, was plotting out the future of the case, and I was asked to assist from time to time. Of course, that took quite a lengthy period of time, because there were discoveries of various government officials, and the government examined Leilani, and all those sorts of things, the kinds of things that happened in the legal process. But by the time the case actually came to trial in 1995, June of 1995, I was one of the two lawyers who actually went to court and handled the case for Leilani.
Mm-hmm.
So over that period of time, I got to know her. I got to know her circumstances, and it broadened out into the larger picture in about the end of February, beginning of March of 1995, when the government discovered what had been thought to be the lost records of the Eugenics Board. And it was at that point that the matter took on a whole new dimension. Well, I have a PhD in German literature, and my focus was on Martin Luther and his approach to language as being a living, active thing that actually impacts people. God's Word, when God speaks, it matters. It makes people, can lead people to be moral beings. I think that my work on Martin Luther prepared me in some ways to understand the depth of significance that the language people used in relation to the mentally handicapped, for example, had a profound impact on their lives and on how people treated them. One of my most, and I was very fortunate to be involved in this case and the subsequent cases. One of the most significant experiences was being the one to go over to Alberta Justice and read the Eugenics Board files in their original state. So I spent, I think it was close to 4 weeks, sitting over at Alberta Justice. This was before they were copied for production at trial and so forth. I had the original documents in a number of boxes in front of me, and I read all of them and took notes as best I could. So I was reading about these fragile lives on onion skin paper copies, and the contents were so moving because I knew that in these few records about each person there was an enormous backstory for each of them. And when I read things such as a 3-year-old boy having been sterilized along with his whole family, and I thought of Hannah Arendt's book, The Banality of Evil. This evil, she didn't mean that evil is banal, but she meant that it can be fragmented into administrivia, as we call it today, so that you get a system going, and it's very difficult to see or rescue or care about the individuals who are caught up in that system. And there's so many systems like that. But this seemed to me to be one of the saddest systems I had encountered. Well, I think that one aspect of administrative systems that catch people up in them, so to speak, for good or for evil, is that they go on and they go on and they go on. And they achieve an impetus that's very difficult to break. And in those days, and I'm talking, the period of 1928 to 1972 virtually, excuse me, in those days, there was very little focus on getting information out to the public so the public could judge it, so to speak. Today in our wired world, we expect to know, we expect to be able to let our voices be registered on the internet and elsewhere. We feel we ought to have a say. I don't think that was the case in those days. There were people, crusaders, do-gooders, who fought to get underneath the surface of things, and then came back up and said, this isn't right. But generally speaking, people let these systems roll on, and especially when they were out of sight and out of mind. I mean, after all, these are people who were taken to places like Ponoka, Alberta Hospital, Edmonton, as well as the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives, as it was called, now the Michener Center. And it was a very different place from the Michener Center today. And I certainly understand why there is a fair outcry at the recent closure of the Michener Center, because the purpose of the Michener Center has changed so much. It no longer is the bureaucratic nightmare that it was in the earlier days. Although I should say that after reading a whole lot of records, not just Leilani's, but hundreds of other records in multiple, hundreds of binders, my overall impression is that there were many good people staffing the Provincial Training School who tried to do their best for these people. But they too were caught up in the administration of a regime which was legitimized by the laws of the time and the practices of the time and the beliefs of the time. So that it wasn't all bad for the people there. But what it didn't do was to give them the individual stimulation, the individual chances that they deserved in life. Well, along with the many individuals' files I read and studied, I also looked at the general information emanating from the Provincial Training School. I looked at the clinic files that came in. I saw a lot of correspondence from people like the medical superintendent, Dr. Levan. And I also gained impressions from examining various staff members during the course of discoveries prior to trial. And as I said, many of them were very well-meaning and did some good things and cared about the individuals. I never met Dr. Levan. He died in, I think it was 1981. My impression of him is that he was a competent administrator. He had some fair-mindedness in terms of how he dealt with individuals. He, however, was a product of the times. He believed in the system. He wanted to to bring more and more people into the provincial training school. So the systems that might otherwise have been in place to ensure that no one who shouldn't have been there, who was not eligible, if you can call it that, to be there, I don't think those systems were good at all. So that you brought in people, or they brought in people such as Leilani, who really should not have been there. And there were letters on her file which should have alerted Dr. Levan to the fact that she was not I'm using this term, of course, guardedly, that she was not a mental defective. And had she had proper schooling and a proper family environment, she would have been among the range of average Alberta citizens. Mm-hmm. And she is, despite all of the odds. But Dr. Levan was interested in experimenting. After all, this was his career. So he did some things which came out in the correspondence, which were not things that we would agree to have been professional today. Well, I'm thinking of the methods of sterilization that came out at trial. So this is not new news. It was heard at trial. It came out during the cross-examination of the member of the Eugenics Board who was called by the government to testify, Dr. Margaret Thompson. And she and Dr. Levan engaged in some correspondence while she was sitting on the Eugenics Board to have her acquire some genetic material from what were then termed male mongoloids. Today we call them Down's syndrome, individuals with Down syndrome. And he agreed that she could have some of this material. So it was forwarded to her as a result of the sterilization procedures carried on at the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And she acknowledged at trial that there's no possibility that men with Down syndrome are fertile. So there was no need to sterilize them. During cross-examination, I asked her if it was known at the time that men with Down syndrome were invariably infertile. Why were you approving their sterilization? And her answer was, I think you would agree with me that nothing much was lost. And that was probably the most dramatic moment in my legal career, because the courtroom was absolutely silent. The judge was silent. And it was very difficult to say anything after an answer like that. Dr. Margaret Thompson was a very interesting witness. And I think what impressed itself upon me most was that here was a strong woman, obviously an intellectual, professor, recipient of the Order of Canada, and still defending the eugenics system. And there were people, of course, who were professors at the University of Alberta who were involved in this system. What is clear to me is that that is a testimony to the strength of the eugenics concept, and the fact that it wasn't a sideline, so to speak, for the academic community. It was part of, in many cases, I'm sure, a genuine belief that you could improve people by ensuring that only the best people propagated themselves. And so you have to see the history, you have to see what the Eugenics Board was doing in that context, because otherwise you make them out to be only evil. And they certainly didn't see themselves that way. They didn't see themselves as doing something wrong. We're shadowed, of course, by the Nazi experience, the Holocaust. If it had not been for that, maybe we wouldn't react quite so strongly as we do to this now debunked concept of eugenics, which, of course, I recognize raises itself in different forms today. We aren't through with that. We'll never be through with it, I don't think, until we value individuals, each individual, as different, perhaps, but entirely of the quality and the worth of every other individual. Nobody, not one of us, is able to do that successfully all the time. And no system can be set up which actually does that. And that's our problem. We have lots of good people mixed up in things which occasionally go off the tracks, like this one did. And it's very much off the tracks. But we shouldn't pride ourselves today that we have overcome that sort of thing. It's just disguised in a different guise. And someday, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, somebody might say, look at those people and how they operated in the early 2000s. Look what they did to people. It is puzzling when one thinks about what a huge impact on the world the knowledge of what happened under the Nazis had. And I think people generally knew about it, except the Holocaust deniers, of course, by about 1950. I think that knowledge would have percolated through society. And of course it generated the human rights movements and all the things we've seen in various countries. But in Alberta, of course, the repeal of the Sexual Sterilization Act did not take place until 1972, and in fact the Mental Defectives Act was strengthened in some ways in 1955. So one has to ask oneself, why did it take so long to get to 1972? And I suppose there's no one single answer to that. I think it's a puzzle, but parts of the puzzle would be the fact that social credit was still strong right up until the Lougheed forces came to power in 1972, and they were prepared to do things in a new way, whereas the social credit government had been going on and on and on for a very long time, and the momentum was simply there. Another factor, I think, would be that Dr. Levan had made a very effective empire in Red Deer for the Provincial Training School. He certainly was able to convince people that he was running a very good operation. In some senses it was. And he was taking troublesome people off the street, so to speak. You know, there were and of course the other thing about that institution is that it, along with Deerholm, was supplying the community with ready labor. That is, the boys were sent out to work for farmers, and the girls were sent to work as housekeepers around Red Deer. So there was, I think, very little interest in disrupting this effective system for generating good labor outcomes from people who were marginal when they went in. And I think many of the people, both in and outside of the institution, really believed that this was a good system for these people, that they could be brought into society eventually, some of them, not all of them, and made into productive people. When I talk about the range of people in the Provincial Training School, many of whom could go out and do farm work and go out and do housekeeping and other related sort of jobs, it must be remembered that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, what constituted a mental challenge or mental defect was much more broadly defined than we would do it today. Mm-hmm. The DSM, those kinds of things were, I don't know when that system of categorizing mental illnesses and so forth was started, but today we have a much more differentiated and careful way of approaching people's diagnoses. In those days, you just said, well, this person has been caught stealing. Obviously, there's something mentally wrong with this person. Therefore, they must be a mental defective. Let's put them in the training school. And remember the word training school. That has the aura of a prison system where you are training people to be functioning citizens after they've done something wrong. So we're not talking about the same population today as we were then. And I think that's something that the population as a whole is still coming to grips with. Mm-hmm. You know, I encounter this now because I'm on the Canadian Mental Health Association regional board, and you understand through that kind of work that mental illness and mental capacity is not an easily understood concept, and people will draw the lines in a whole number of different places. Mm-hmm. Well, I've never been institutionalized, but I have read a lot about it, and I've met a lot of people, of course, in the course of this case who have been institutionalized. And there's no doubt that sometimes institutionalization can be a rescue for people who have very, very difficult backgrounds. It can also be an opportunity to deliver services effectively to people who are profoundly in need of things, such as the people who now inhabit the Michener Center. But the people that I worked with during this case, the Muir case and afterwards, were very, very much affected by the institutionalization of it, because institutions simply don't react well to individual needs in the sense that we think of them. They're not like a family. Sometimes the better ones try to replicate a family experience where each individual can be cherished and nourished in their individuality. But to be in the institution in the 1950s, for example, at the Provincial Training School, was to be thought of as being deficient over people on the outside, so that they needed to be put in their place by routine, if I can put it that way. So you get up in the morning and you have to make your bed a certain way. It's what occurs to me is that it's something like the military. You know, you have certain routines that are supposed to make you a good soldier. Well, you had certain routines in this institution to bring you up from being defective into being a person who could be useful to society. So you had certain times to eat, certain times to work, certain times to do whatever. Many of them had routines where they were either punished or assigned to go to the lower functioning wards and take care of the individuals there. And for small children, that would be quite a difficult experience. Mm-hmm. But they were expected to do those things and to do manual labor of one sort and another. And for some, that might have been a useful way to spend their time. For others who were sensitive to that in different ways, it might have been a real shock and a real difficult thing to do. But that's to bring in the individual element again. Mm-hmm. And in an institution like that, you had regimes and routines. And those regimes and routines were thought to be good for the people. The question of whether the sterilization case would have had a different outcome had someone other than Leilani been the chief plaintiff is a difficult one for a variety of reasons. First of all, Leilani is a very unique and special person. And she advocates for herself and for others. And she is entirely sincere in what she says and does. And she has a huge heart that cares for people and a real sense of justice and injustice. And she came to it through a very hard life, including the 10 years she was in the Provincial Training School. But the question of whether it would have been different is if it had been someone in a wheelchair or someone more, someone profoundly handicapped, is not easy to answer. But I think it helps to look at it from the point of view of two separate questions. One is the wrongful sterilization side, and the other is the wrongful confinement side, because Justice Veit gave damages to Leilani for both of those situations. So let's take the wrongful sterilization side first. And that is that Leilani was clearly someone who did not fall within the scope of the Sexual Sterilization Act and not within the Mental Defectives Act, so that she was not eligible, so to speak, or subject to being sterilized under the legislation as it existed at the time. And the government recognized that by not calling on its defense that she was out of time under the limitations of action statutes. And the government recognized it in its settlement with a lot of other people who have a range of difficulties, right down to the profoundly handicapped. And the government, in effect, acknowledged that none of these people should have really been sterilized. From the point of view of today, we're looking back on today. These people are alive. They suffered this, and it was wrong. On the confinement side, certainly Leilani was wrongfully confined. She was not eligible for confinement in the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives, but her parents dropped her off there. She came from that kind of family who didn't want her. So she may have had a slightly, well, I think she did have a better life in the institution than she would have had at home. But that's something that only she can say, and it's very difficult to know because she wasn't at home for those years. But her life before those years was traumatic. There is a case to be made for saying that in the circumstances of the times when there weren't group homes and there weren't special places for people with handicaps to live and to be nourished, that the institution was a necessary one. I know from my time early in Canada, when I lived in Barrhead, that there were mentally handicapped individuals who were secreted away in their homes and never got out. They were kept away from other people. And it was only when what was called the School of Good Hope was founded in, it was about 1972 or 3, that the rest of the community began to learn that there were these individuals in their midst, but were not receiving any kind of services whatsoever. And in some cases, maybe some bad treatment from their families without any opportunity for intervention. So I think we need to look at the Provincial Training School from that perspective too, that in some cases the people were better off and there were no alternatives, or very few alternatives in those days. Today we do have alternatives. Maybe not for the people currently in Michener, but we better find some if they're going to close it. I don't know how surprised people were about this case and the situations of people other than Leilani, but certainly Leilani's case, once it was decided and the judgment was out it was such a stunning judgment. It certainly was hot and heavy in the media for a while. And so perhaps a lot of people were surprised about this, especially younger people who were not acquainted with this regime, had been born maybe after 1972 or grown up after 1972. For some of the older people, they may have known about this. Certainly some of the older people would have known about the people isolated in their midst, in remote farmhouses and that sort of thing. But I think it would have, in those people who cared, would have generated a lot of thought about what was happening. It wasn't just a social problem, but it was a program legitimized by the government to deal with these people. And people would have recalled, I think, that things had improved dramatically since the repeal of the Sexual Sterilization Act. One only has to look at the population in the Michener Center today as compared to when Leilani was there to understand what a very different place it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When I retired, I certainly realized that I had had a very fortunate opportunity to be involved in the sexual sterilization cases and to get to know this chapter of Alberta's history. It shook me up at the time. It gave me the privilege of knowing some very fine people such as Leilani. It made me think about the way systems operate and administrative constructs can arise with government support to do things which are not in the best interests of people. Made me humble. It made me realize that it's very important that we don't forget. We have many, many important things to remember. You know, our last World War I survivor died not that long ago. People in World War II are dying. People who were in the concentration camps are dying. They need to have a legacy of people who have enough empathy in them not to forget them. Memory is incredibly important. And we need more than just family memory. That is a great aunt who happened to be sterilized. We need some means of continuing the history or the historical memory. We need the means by which this whole long chapter in Alberta's history can be accessed and available to those who care to find out about it. It really, in my view, can't be lost. I may be one of the very few people who has actually read it all. And that's quite a responsibility. I can't remember it all, but I know how important it is, and I want other people to know about it too.